Good evening, everyone. Welcome to, I guess, what is our fourth session for PPA 660 organization theory. So after tonight's class, we have two sessions left. We have our unusual Monday session on the 29th, and then we have our final session for next Wednesday. I guess that's what, July the 1st. And so it's kind of hard to believe that we're almost in July, but next week is July. So that's what we have left in terms of our Zoom sessions. I also would like to remind you about your upcoming assignments. And so Canvas essay number 3, which draws upon classical theory that we've talked about previously, that Canvas essay in 2 responses are due on June 29th. And then you have Canvas essay number 4. That's your final Canvas essay, and that one draws upon human relations and human resource management. So Mary Parker Follett, Douglas McGregor. And that Canvas essay is then due, I believe we have that due on July the 2nd. And then you also have your organizational analysis paper and your final assessment that are also then due on July the 2nd. The way the university works summer session, this class had to fall within the first summer session, which is why we have this unusual arrangement, but we won't get into all of that again. But the way in which university does that summer session 1 is it ends summer session 1 before the 4th of July weekend. And the university kind of views, since the 4th of July falls on a Saturday, they view the entire weekend, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, as being a holiday weekend, and therefore the university and all classes are closed. So that's why we end on technically July the 2nd. And so that's why those assignments are then due by July the 2nd. In terms of the organizational analysis paper, I think we've discussed that at length, so I think you have a good idea of how that works and what you're doing for that. Again, be parsimonious, be as concise as you can be. Just address all those different sections I have listed for you in the syllabus. Typically, those papers tend to come in under 10 pages, and so you don't have to write a dissertation for it. So it's going to be a relatively brief paper. And then for that final assessment, where you're only answering those 3 questions about Cal State Long Beach, and so the classical elements, the neoclassical HR and human resource management elements, and then the third question looking at the system that the university operates in. For each one of those 3 questions, 1 to 2 paragraphs would certainly be enough to suffice. So the final assessment is even shorter. Those usually come in around somewhere about 3 to 4 pages. So you don't have to worry about the quantity of what you're writing. It is essentially about the quality. And hopefully, since both of those assignments have been available to you since we started the class, you've been formulating your ideas and maybe writing those assignments. And so hopefully it's not something that you're going to have to all put together next week. Hopefully you have most of those assignments at least thought out, if not already written. So again, Canvas Essay 3, due on the 29th by midnight. Canvas Essay 4, due by July 2nd by midnight. Organizational analysis paper and final assessment also due by July 2nd at midnight. So what I will then do is spend my July 4th weekend grading and making sure that I can get through all the grading for this class by the following Monday, and then get the grades uploaded into the system by that following Monday so that you are then ready to move onward and upward to your next class that begins, I believe, on July 11th. And I believe that is public budgeting with Dr. Williams. Erica, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Powell. Quick question. I know you just went over the summer dates and why we have to end the class before the 4th of July weekend. With our PPA 500 and 670, I know we ended that class on a Saturday and we still had up until Sunday to submit our last assignment. So we have to submit all of our assignments by July 2nd. There is no way if we needed an extra day or two to get that.
If you need an extra day or two, just send me an email and let me
Okay.
know, and we can certainly accommodate that. Yeah. It's just my hope is that most of the assignments can come in before the July 4th weekend so I can spend the weekend getting them graded. But as always, just send me an email and we can certainly accommodate it.
Makes sense. Thank you so much.
Sure. So, Jesus, can we answer the final assessment questions right the question, would you like them in essay style? You can answer them directly after the questions. And so if you want to just copy and paste the questions into a file and this answer directly after each one of those questions, that's absolutely fine. It does not have to be in a paper format, just straight to the point in terms of answering the questions. Ashley, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. You may have already said this in one of your other classes, but confirming for the organizational analysis and the final assessment, is it sufficient if we're, referencing everything in the lectures and then having like a citation page at the end with the textbook, or do you want like very specific page references of where we're getting this information from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My expectations is I'm looking at the organizational analysis paper and the final assessment as truly being assessments, which means that unless if you are using outside research, and by outside research, I mean anything other than the textbook, the readings that have been provided, the lecture notes that are provided, then you should include a reference page with those citations. However, if you are only using the material that was provided to you here in the class, you don't have to worry about a reference page because I have access to all the same material and I know where to find everything. And so you don't have to worry about a reference sheet unless you are getting material outside of what was provided for you for the course.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Mhm. And along those lines with the organizational analysis paper, and I say, it should be in APA format. I'm not a big stickler on APA, unlike maybe a previous instructor you had. And so as long as kind of in the general sense of APA, that's going to be good enough for me. And especially if you're not using outside resources, then the whole adherence to APA is not all that important for this organizational analysis paper. Maybe more important for other papers that you do in future courses, but I'm really looking at these assignments as truly assessments of what you have learned and how well you can take the information you learned and apply that information appropriately to the organization that you are discussing. Or in the case of the final assessment, to California State University, Long Beach. Again, if you do need an extra day or two in terms of the assignments, send me an email and we can certainly make those accommodations. So that's not a major problem. One other thing I will point out before we dive headfirst into the other theories we're going to talk about tonight is our presentations. And so you know that you'll also have to do a very, very brief informal presentation of your organizational analysis paper. By very brief, we're talking about maybe around 5 to 10 minutes, certainly no more than 10 minutes. By informal, we mean that if you want to use PowerPoint slides, you certainly can do that. You're not required to. A lot of people like to do that to kind of give them that agenda to follow as they're doing their presentation. But these very brief informal presentations, the majority of them will occur next Wednesday. Now, we are a very large cohort, and so that means that's a lot of presentations to sit through in one evening, which sometimes can be a little bit difficult, especially in terms of fitting all that within the time parameters of next Wednesday's session. So that's my long-winded way of asking that if anyone is interested in doing their presentation next Monday on the 29th, please send me an email and let me know that, and then I can always slot you in into that Monday schedule. What we'll do is the second part of the class on Monday, we'll devote that to presentations. So anyone who wants to present on Monday, send me an email and I'll put you on the agenda. What I will do for both the Monday as well as the Wednesday session, I will enable screen sharing for everyone. So you don't have to send your slides to me for approval. You can just go ahead and share your slides out when it comes time for your presentation. Things tend to move along a lot better that way, and then I don't have to advance your slides for you. You can advance through your slides through your presentation. But anyone, if we could get maybe 5 or 6 or 7 folks who would be willing to do their presentations on Monday, that would certainly be ideal. Now, if no one volunteers, I'm not going to require anyone to do a presentation on Monday, since Monday is an unusual arrangement for us and it's what we consider to be an optional session. So only by volunteer. And so if you want to volunteer, send me an email. Otherwise, all the rest of the presentations we will then take care of next Wednesday. But again, these should be very, very short presentations. And what I will do is I will, to make sure we get through all the presentations, is we'll target 5 minutes. I'll give you up to 10 minutes, but then at 10 minutes, unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut the presentation off just so we'll have time for other presentations.
Dr. Powell, would you be open to like if somebody on Monday was like, okay, I think I was able to finish, will we be able to just present at the end, or would you prefer if still volunteer knowing beforehand?
No, if you're willing, if you get everything done and we get to that point on Monday night and you are ready to present, yeah, just let me know during class, and then we'll go ahead and do your presentation. So yeah,
Okay.
we can be very flexible on Monday in that regard.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, because I feel confident I can finish everything, but I just never know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I understand that, especially at this time of the course.
Yes,
So.
thank you.
Let's see. I think there is I'll double check the Canvas site, but I believe that there is a link on there to submit the final assessment. I'll go back and double check after class is over and make sure that all the links are working. Some of the links I know they may be time sensitive in terms of they open at a certain time, so I'll make sure that there are no time limitations so that everything is open and you can go ahead and submit any of those assignments early if you would like. I always value early assignments and I always appreciate early assignments. So you don't have to wait until July 2nd. If you have it done, you can go ahead and submit it as soon as it is finished. Okay. I think that's most of our housekeeping items for the evening. So what we are going to plan on doing tonight is we are going to pick up where we left off last time, and we're going to talk first off about systems theory, the school of systems theory, and we'll distinguish between what we consider to be natural versus open systems theory. And I'll kind of show you how we progressed from natural systems theory that we borrowed from the field of biology that was developed way back in the 1920s, and how we took that and we applied it to our public organizations. So we'll do systems theory. After systems theory, depending upon how we're progressing, I have some breakout rooms that we can do, a breakout room exercise we can do looking at systems theory. Then after we're done with that, we'll turn our attention to what I consider in this class to be the more modern theories. And I hate air quotes, but I'll use air quotes for modern, in that we're considering them to be modern theories. It doesn't mean that they were all developed over the past couple of decades, but it means that we have applied them to public organizations in the not too distant past. And so that's why I consider them to be modern theories. We'll talk things like participative management and quality management and see how far we get with that. Then next Monday, we will finish up whatever we have not covered up to that point in time. And as I said, the second half of class then for anyone who would like to do their presentation. So that is what our agenda is looking like. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our discussion of the School of Systems Theory. And like I said, systems theory is another one of these theories that we borrowed from another field, and actually from the natural sciences. So the idea of a systems approach to understanding phenomena actually came out of the world of biology way back in the 1920s. Yeah, I'm sure you read about that in the chapter on natural systems theory. You read about our good friend Ludwig von Bertalanffy. I'm terrible at pronouncing his name, but we'll just call him Ludwig. And his development of this idea of systems theory to apply in the natural sciences. And we have then taken that and we have applied it to our public organizations. The whole idea of viewing an organization within this context of a system is to view our organizations from a much more holistic point of view, whereby we understand that in a system, a change in one part of that system will probably have an impact upon the entire system in its totality. So a change in an organization can have an impact upon an environment, and a change in the environment can have an impact upon the organization. So it's a much more holistic view of public organizations. There is also very much of a rational element involved in a systems approach to studying organizations. We view organizations as being instruments for achieving goals and objectives. And so, a lot of what we're doing in systems theory is we are studying the system either within the organization or external to the organization for the purpose of understanding how the environments, internal or external, help us achieve our goals. For natural systems theorists, the ultimate goal is agency survival. So they really viewed the goal of an organization is for that organization to survive into the future. Open systems theorists are also interested in agency survival, but their focus is a bit more on agency growth and how can we leverage the external environment to grow the organization. But either way, it's a rational perspective in that we are trying to understand how better to accomplish these goals. The natural systems perspective. That perspective really views organizations as being similar to living organisms, and they're living organisms trying to survive. And so every living organism is trying to find a way to survive into the future. Living organisms, in order to survive, need to adapt to their environments. So, but the primary focus in terms of environment is really on the environment internal to the organization. So we're asking the question, if you think about an organization as a living organism, you think about it as, say, similar to a human being. From the moment that human being is born, that human being unfortunately starts a decaying process whereby that human being starts to dissipate energy and resources into the external environment. Whenever an organization or an organism dissipates energy into the external environment, that is a process known as entropy. All organisms go through a process of entropy. And since in this natural systems theory, we are viewing organizations as organisms, they will all go through this entropy process as well. So what we're trying to understand with natural systems theory is as organizations go through this entropy process, how can they organize their internal environment to try and stave off death and decay? How can they survive longer into the future? So that's kind of the natural systems perspective, looking at organizations as being similar to living organisms. Contrast that then with the open systems perspective. Now, as we'll see in an upcoming slide, open and natural systems perspectives really do share a lot of similarities in terms of the way they're structured and what they're attempting to do. But the primary difference is, again, that natural systems looks internal, open systems looks external. So internal versus external focus. And we'll pick up on that and talk more about that in just a second. But both a natural as well as an open systems approach share some of the similar assumptions. One assumption that they both share is that systems lack a concrete existence, meaning that systems are dynamic and systems are temporary. So systems, just because you have one system that looks the way in which it looks today, doesn't mean it's going to be in existence a year from now or look the same a year from now. So there is no concrete existence to these systems. They are dynamic and they are changing in nature. A second assumption that underlies both natural and open systems approach is the focus on the development of conceptual frameworks. So both approaches assume that if we are going to better understand our organizations and now they operate within their environments, we are going to do that through creating these conceptual frameworks. So we're going to create these theories that will help us understand why some organizations exist and thrive and why some organizations deteriorate and go out of existence. But we do it by creating these conceptual frameworks. And the focus of both natural and open systems theories is really going to be on the interdependence of the parts. So for natural systems theorists, they are looking at the interdependence of the parts within the organization itself, that internal environment. For an open systems theorist, they're going to look at the interdependence of the parts between the organization and the external environment. But we assume that there is collaboration, there is interdependence, there is an interplay going on between all the parts of this system. And our job is to develop the conceptual framework to understand how all those parts interact with each other to, again, help organizations grow and thrive. Also, a commonality between natural and open systems theories is this focus on equilibrium. All organizations are geared toward and work toward trying to find this balance, this equilibrium point. And both natural and open systems theorists will argue that structural systems are going to naturally trend toward equilibrium. So you're always trying to find this balance. For the natural systems theorists, the balance was an internal balance. And so if you think again about the organization as a human being is in balance when the blood pressure is normal, when their oxygenation level is normal, their pulse ox level is normal, they're devoid of diseases and illnesses. That's a state of health, and that's a state of harmony. Well, organizations are also looking for that state of organizational harmony as well when everything is working together. The better that you have the state of organizational harmony, the better chance that organization has to meet its ultimate goal of trying to survive. That equilibrium, that balance for our open systems theorists, is a balance between the organization and its external environment. And so one of the big differences here between natural and open systems theory is that natural systems theorists are much more focused on how the external environment affects the health of the organization. So it's kind of this one-way street. How does the environment affect the organization? For open systems theorists, it becomes a two-way street. Not only how does the environment affect the organization, but how can the behaviors and the actions of the organization affect its surrounding environment as well? So in open systems theory, we are looking for a balance between the organization and its external environment. But whether you're a natural systems theorist and looking internal to the organization, or an open systems theorist and looking outside the organization, this point of equilibrium, this balance point, is what's known as the point of homeostasis. So this is a point where the regulation of the internal structure and processes match well with what's going on in the external environment. So this is this balance that we are always striving for as an organization. A lot of systems theorists would refer to this as the steady state. So they're hoping to find this steady state, this equilibrium, this balance point, this point of homeostasis, because the better an organization can find its homeostasis, the better that organization can survive into the future. And again, at the end of the day, for natural systems theorists, it's about agency survival. For open systems theorists, it's not only about organizational survival, it's also about organizational growth. So they're both focused on trying to find this point of homeostasis. So those are some of the differences and some of the similarities between natural and open systems theories. So let's start delving more into natural systems theory and talk about some of the specifics and put a finer point on what natural system theory is. So building off of this biological idea of systems theory, you had people like Chester Barnard and others, but we're going to focus on Chester Barnard here. People like Chester Barnard, who made the argument that when we look at organizations as organisms, we understand that there are a lot of different moving parts within organizations. And in order for the organization to successfully survive, you need to have good cooperation. You need to have all these different parts working in harmony with each other. So Chester Barnard, with his natural systems theory, is assuming a cooperative system whereby you have two or more individuals or parts of an organization that are cooperating together to achieve the same or similar goals. We know that from our discussion last time of Chester Barnard in the framework of human relations theory. So last week we presented him as a human relations theorist. This week we're presenting him as a natural systems theorist. So last week we said that Barnard told us that successful managers were only successful if they were able to get the acquiescence and the compliance of their employees. That's that cooperation. So as we know, it's very much of this transactional type of relationship where you have managers who provide incentives to employees and use those incentives to then extract contributions from their employees to contribute to the success and the survival of the organization. So Barnard tells us all organizations need to obtain resources and they need to obtain these contributions from the members of the organization. Now, also remembering last week with our discussion of Barnard, he is really looking at this balance. So he's really focused on this equilibrium. And the balance that he's really looking at is the balance between the contributions we get from employees and the incentives or rewards that we provide to those employees. Again, very much of a type of transactional type of leadership. We also talked last week about this whole idea of equity in organizations. And when employees feel that they are putting in more contributions than they're getting out in rewards, they're not going to be motivated to work harder and they're going to be less productive. So Barnard understands that the types of incentives we give people must be valued by those individuals in order for them to put forth the contributions we need as an organization. Kind of going back to that room theory that we talked about, the whole idea of expectancy theory, that people put a valence, a value level on these incentives. So we need to know our employees and know what they value. Barnard says in order to balance these contributions with rewards, if the contributions that we are getting from our employees in terms of their effort and their commitment to the organization and their skills and all those types of good contributions, in order for those contributions to really contribute to the efficiency of an organization, the net value of those contributions that we're getting from our employees must exceed the net dissatisfaction of those employees. So whenever we ask an employee to do something and to provide a contribution, there could be some dissatisfaction on the part of that employee in that they don't want to put forth that additional effort. But if that level of dissatisfaction on our employees is less than the amount of contributions that we can get from those employees, that is what Chester Barnard would consider to be an indicator of organizational efficiency. So to be efficient as an organization, the net value of the contributions must exceed the net value of the dissatisfaction levels of our employees. Then, under his approach to natural systems theory, there's also the idea of effectiveness. And simply for Barnard, effectiveness was a measure of how well our organization's achieving its goals. And again, as a natural systems theorist, the primary goal is going to be agency survival. Also, as we remember last week when we talked about with Chester Barnard, there's also a limitation on our ability to get contributions from our employees. And that limitation are these zones of indifference, that every single one of our employees will have their own unique zone of indifference. So if we ask someone to do something that violates their ethical standards, their values, we're probably not going to be able to extract contributions from those employees. So the primary limit on our formal authority as managers to get these contributions is the zones of indifference on our employees. And so we have to operate within the zones of indifference so we do not violate their values and their ethical standards. But again, what Barnard is doing here, very much in line with natural systems theory, is looking for that balance point. How can we balance the contributions and the incentives in order to make our organizations both efficient as well as effective? So you know from last week, Chester Barnard's most favorite famous work was The Functions of the Executive. And so he identifies for us some of the ways in which executives, as he refers to them, leaders and managers, can maintain this balance within our organizations, how they can maintain this equilibrium, this point of homeostasis. He says the one way in which you need to do it is by having a system of communication. You are not going to be able to know the unique zone of indifference of an employee. You're not going to be able to know the valence level that they place upon incentives unless you actually communicate with those employees. So you have to have this open system of communication. Secondly, you have to have the right set of incentives to induce people to join in on this work to provide the contributions that the organization needs. And then you also have to have a clear definition of the goals of the organization. And again, the one overriding goal in natural systems theory is agency survival. So essentially, what natural systems theorists are telling us is that when we view these organizations as living organisms, we realize that as they age, they are going to lose resources and lose energy through this process known as entropy. Because of this entropy process, eventually these organizations are going to lose so many resources and so much energy that they no longer have the resources they need in order to sustain them, and they will then go out of existence. The problem with that, as we'll see with structural functional and open systems theorists, is that we have a lot of organizations that have been around for a very long time. We have organizations that have been around for well over 200 years. Think Department of Treasury, Department of State, and they don't look like they're going anywhere in the near future. So if you've got these organizations that have been around for a couple of hundred years and they are still growing and they are still operating, then it kind of calls into question this whole idea of entropy and organizations decaying and going out of existence. And that's one of the critiques that we will see as we move forward of the natural systems type of an approach. And that, one piece of empirical evidence that argues against natural systems theory is that we still have organizations that exist and grow even 200 years later. So, just like with every other school of thought, natural systems theory also had its critics. And so there are a lot of criticisms of Chester Barnard and natural systems theory. The one I've already mentioned is the empirical evidence that some organizations don't go out of existence and don't lose all of their energies. Another criticism of Barnard is that Barnard and other natural systems theorists accept as unquestioned this hierarchical authority that came to us from the classical theorists of Weber and Taylor and the principles theorists. That they just accepted as unquestioned, that we are going to have this top-down relationship between our executives and our employees. And they never really questioned that. By not questioning that and by just trying to extract contributions from employees and essentially manipulate employees to get the contributions we need, the second criticism is it's highly anti-democratic. It's not what Mary Parker Follett would think would be a democratic type of organization. Also, Barnard does not really provide us with a lot of justification for why we need to have social control of our employees beyond just extracting contributions from them. And Barnard focuses primarily on the formal elements within an organization and oftentimes overlooks the more informal parts of that organization. So Barnard is looking at this relationship in a top-down way between executives and employees within the formal organization structure of that organization. But we know from our human relations and human resource management theorists that organizations are social environments. And so we have informal relationships and informal sub-organizations like groups that form within the organizations. And Barnard really didn't pay a lot of attention to that informality. He was much more focused on the formal types of collaborative relationships in the organization. But again, the criticism is it tends to be relatively exploitative. We're exploiting employees just to get the contributions we need to keep our organization surviving into the future. So when we take natural systems theory writ large and Chester Barnard specifically, and we look at him in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness, Tompkins would argue to us that Barnard and natural systems theory will emphasize all four of those models: human relations, internal process, rational goal, and open system. Now, again, here is a situation where I wish that the open system cell could be shaded in much lighter than the other cells, because the real focus is going to be on internal process, human relations in terms of how you work with your employees to get these contributions, rational goal, because we agree the goal of the organization is agency survival, but less so in terms of open systems. I think the linkage here with open systems is the focus on how changes in the environment are affecting the relationships within the organization, and how does the external environment affect the ability of the organization to get the resources and the contributions that it needs in order to survive in the future. So I would argue that the linkage to open systems model is much more tenuous than the linkage to those other three models of organizational effectiveness. But in terms of the rational goal model, we have an agreed upon goal, and that rational goal is agency survival. Clearly, we have a lot of direct supervision in terms of mechanisms for coordination and control, because you have those executives who are working with those employees to extract contributions from them. So it's certainly not that mutual adjustment. The executive identifies what contributions are necessary and then what incentives to provide to get those contributions. So it's a very top-down, centralized, direct supervision approach, much in line with our classical theorists. Then there's also, according to Tompkins, standardization of values. The hope here is that the primary value of the organization and shared by individual employees is the sustainability of the organization, if you will. This whole idea of agency survival. In terms of our motivational strategies, because we are providing incentives to our employees to gain contributions from them, you certainly have instrumental rewards. You have a focus on rewards for performance. I would argue a little bit less so for considerate leadership. You do talk with these employees, but primarily to know how to get the contributions from them. Group acceptance, I believe that group acceptance is much more for the formal groups within the organization as opposed to the informal groups. And then certainly some goal congruence, because what we are hoping to see here is that individuals and the organization will both have as their ultimate goal the survival of the agency into the future. Now, all of that being said, in terms of natural systems theory, I would argue, and I don't think you're surprised by this, that it is relatively unusual for us to see a public or nonprofit organization that operates truly within a natural or closed environment. Oftentimes, natural systems theory is associated with the term closed system theory as well. Because when you're a natural systems theorist and you're focusing internal to the organization, you are focusing on the organization as its own environment. So your focus is really much more in this type of closed type of orientation. So sometimes people refer to natural systems theory as a closed type of system. And very few of our organizations operate in truly closed systems. The vast majority of our organizations need to contend with their environments and need to take actions to influence their environments as opposed to only being influenced by their environments. Now, this movement from natural to open systems theory, we said systems theory really finds its genesis in biology back in the 1920s. Then Chester Barnard in the 1940s and the 1950s starts applying it to organizations, likening these organizations to organisms. Then, as we move through the 1950s and the 1960s, we start to transition away from natural systems theory and transition more toward open systems theory. And Tompkins exposes you to a separate chapter in his textbook called Structural Functional Theory. And he introduces you to a variety of different authors who are considered to be structural functional theorists, people like Gouldner and Blau and Merton. And the one that I really like to focus on in this class is Robert Merton, as what I like to refer to as a functional theorist. Robert Merton is very useful to us at this point in our discussion and in the evolution of the literature because Robert Merton's functional theory helps to move us away from viewing organizations as living organisms and push us more down toward the road for open systems theory. So I really look at functional theory and Robert Merton as a nice segue to move us from natural to open systems theory. And so that's why I kind of put Robert Merton in between natural and open systems. So Robert Merton, in what were called his middle range theories, made the argument that he was questioning this analogy of a living organism. And he questioned this whole idea of organizations as living organisms because he said organizations, every activity of an organization is not necessarily important for the goals of that organization. Sometimes we see organizations engage in activities that do not foster and promote the goals of the organization. So not every activity is important for goals, which means that not every activity is important for agency survival. Since the natural systems theorists tell us the goal is survival, not everything an organization does fosters and promotes its survival. And one example of that I like to use in the 535 Intergovernmental Relations class is the example of the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. And so kind of bear with me a little bit. I'm going to digress a little bit on what the Advisory Commission was as an example of an organization that does not always take actions that they know will foster their survival. So if you're not familiar with it, there was an organization, past tense, called the United States Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, otherwise known as the ACIR. The ACIR was created back in 1959, and the primary job of the ACIR was to study the relationships between national, state, and local governments to understand how these three levels of government can interact more productively with each other. We all know that we have this system of American federalism where some tasks and duties are left to the national government, some are left to state governments, and some are left to local governments. So the ACIR really was trying to understand how the three levels could work more effectively together. So what the ACIR would do is it would contract with scholars around the country, federalism scholars around the country, to put together a series of these studies of how the three levels of government can work more effectively for certain policies and certain programs. Every year, they produce a series of reports. They were very useful reports, and I think ACIR was really a credit to our system of American federalism. Fast forward, though, into the mid-1990s. And in 1995, the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations commissioned a report looking at different important mandates that were being handed down from the national government. So different policies such as the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and others. And so then entered into contracts with scholars across the country. I worked on one of the contracts looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act and the impact of the mandates within the ADA on local school districts. So my part was just a really small part of this study. But the study was put together and it was a draft report that then got leaked to Congress. Once Congress saw the draft report, Congress was not very happy with the findings in the report, because what ACIR found is that a lot of these federal mandates should be handed down to the state government. And so instead of having the national government telling state governments what to do, we should empower state governments to make their own decisions in terms of these different policies. Well, clearly Congress doesn't like that. Because if we know anything about elected officials, the number one goal of any elected official is to remain an elected official, to get reelected. So members of Congress like to use a lot of these mandates to claim credit for what they were achieving in office to help them get reelected. So Congress was ticked off that the ACR was saying Congress shouldn't be doing these things anymore. And so Congress, in its response, took away all the appropriations from the ACIR for fiscal year 1996. Once ACIR lost all of its appropriations, ACIR went out of business. So they had to close up shop. They couldn't do contracts anymore. They couldn't have any staff members. The director of the ACIR then left that position and went back to a faculty position at a small college in Pennsylvania. And that was the end of the ACIR. So if you want to put it, make a tombstone or a headstone for ACIR, it lived from 1959 until 1996. In putting that report together, ACIR knew that Congress would not be happy with that report. They knew that it could threaten their survival, but they did it anyway because they felt that the research was sound and that these were sound recommendations that would be beneficial to our system of federalism. So that's a long-winded example of an agency that did something that ran counter to its survival. And this is what Merton is telling us, that organizations will take those types of actions that do not necessarily ensure their survival. Not every activity that an organization engages in is indispensable for survival. So the importance of Merton is he shifts our focus away from looking at organizations as living organisms that are only trying to survive and shifts our focus away from organization survival to what he refers to as the consequences of the actions of the organization. So what Merton is telling us is that we need to look at the consequences of our outputs for our beneficiaries. So basically look at those outcomes. So these products and these programs and these services that we are providing, what do those services then mean for our beneficiaries? And he says that is important for a variety of reasons. One reason why that is important is that the policies and the programs that our organizations are implementing will remain in place as long as the net consequences of those policies and programs remain positive. So if you want to understand why organizations and their policies and their programs exist into the future, they continue to exist because the net consequences of what they are doing remain positive, that they're having a positive impact upon their beneficiaries. So the focus here is on the beneficiaries. Now, obviously, those beneficiaries are external to the organization. Those beneficiaries are in that external environment. So here, Merton is taking our focus and pulling it from the internal natural systems focus out into the external environment. And by doing so, he is then pushing us down the road toward eventually what we'll talk about with open systems theory. This focus on the consequences for our beneficiaries who exist in our external environment. He argues that when we focus internal to the organization and we are focusing on our policies and our procedures and our rules and our regulations, when we are taking that internal focus, we are losing sight of the big picture. We're kind of losing sight of the forest for the trees. And that big picture is, how are we serving our constituents, our beneficiaries? He says that organizations exhibit what he calls a dysfunction. And the particular dysfunction he looks at is a dysfunction he calls overconformity with rules. He says whenever organizations get too interested in adhering strictly to their rules and their regulations, adhering to those rules and regulations becomes the goal of the organization. But that should not be the goal. The goal of the organization should be serving your beneficiaries. So you end up with this goal displacement. When you overconform with rules, you have goal displacement. You're focusing on the wrong goal. When organizations focus on the wrong goal, when they're focusing on their policies and their procedures and their rules, they end up developing more policies and procedures and rules. And those rules and regulations become very, very specific. They become voluminous. That is what it refers to as a cycle of institutional rigidity. And we've talked about that in this class before. As organizations get older, they tend to get bigger. They tend to then also fragment, where they'll create more units and departments and divisions. Each of those units, departments, and divisions will then create their own sets of rules and procedures and regulations to adhere to. Once you are focusing on adhering to these policies and these procedures, then you're losing sight of your constituencies and you become very rigid in that your goal is adhering to these rules. That then makes it very difficult for your beneficiaries, members of the public, to effectively interface and interact with your organization. These older organizations, as they become more rigid, they form these walls between the organization and the external environment. They essentially close themselves off from their external environment. And that's what institutional rigidity is. Whenever they put up these walls and close themselves off from their beneficiaries in the external environment, that creates a lot of conflict between members of the public and these administrators who are working in these organizations. This is where the bureaucracy ends up getting its bad name. This is where people start saying the bureaucracy is full of red tape. The bureaucracy is impossible to navigate. The bureaucracy is very impersonal. Sometimes they actually look at the bureaucracy as being evil and actually trying to work against the wants, needs, and desires of those beneficiaries. Yeah, Jared, this is what is a lot of people refer to as this is what people like to call the deep state. This is this very negative view of the bureaucracy. But this is a kind of an occurrence that happens in a lot of your older, larger bureaucratic organizations. So Merton says to counter that, we have to shift our focus away from focusing on our rules and regulations and begin to focus more on our beneficiaries and if they are getting what they need from these organizations. If that sounds familiar to you, it should, because that was the major basis for the reinvention of government in the 1990s in the Clinton-Gore administration. In the 1990s, in the Clinton-Gore administration, there was this big reinvention of government movement across the federal government. It led to the reduction in force of over 300,000 federal employees. Granted, a lot of those federal employees were in the Department of Defense, but it was still the largest reduction in federal employment until what we have seen just very recently over the past couple of years. But in addition to reducing the size of the federal government, the goal of the reinvention was to make government operate more efficiently and more effectively by focusing on what these products, these goods and services and policies and programs, what they mean for the people who are consuming them, for our beneficiaries. And so we started talking about citizens as being consumers of the things that we are creating as federal agencies. Very much in alignment with Merton and his functional type of theory. We saw that the problem was defined as not being a problem with the bureaucrats, but the problem instead was with the bureaucracy. That wasn't that administrators weren't doing their job. It was that because of this institutional rigidity and this dysfunction of goal displacement, this is what was causing people to be dissatisfied with the federal bureaucracy and to not have their needs met by the actions taken by these federal agencies. And so we actually saw Robert Merton in practice in the 1990s throughout this entire national performance review and reinvention of the federal government. So Merton is very useful to us because, again, he pulls us away from a natural approach and pulls us more toward open systems theory. So in terms of Robert Burton and functional theory, structural functional theory, we've got all four of our models of organizational effectiveness here because it really does depend upon the wants, needs, and desires of our beneficiaries. So if focusing on human relations helps our beneficiaries, we'll focus on a human relations approach. If focusing on internal processes will help us better serve our beneficiaries, then we'll do that, and so on and so on. And clearly, very much this opening up to an open systems perspective, because that's where our beneficiaries reside in the external environment. Mechanisms for coordination control, there really is no specific mechanism that is highlighted with Robert Merton in functional theory. It is going to depend upon what our beneficiaries need and how we can best serve our beneficiaries. And it's a similar type of thing with our motivational strategies. So there's not one specific motivational strategy that is favored over another. It really does depend upon the needs of the beneficiaries. So here we are seeing much more of this focus on a contextual contingency-based approach. So as opposed to just having this panacea, this one size fits all from the classical school, here we're saying it depends. It depends upon the situation. It depends upon the needs of the beneficiaries that we are serving. So I think Merton is not only a good segue to open systems theory, but he also serves as a nice microcosm to illustrate to us the general trend that we have seen through the evolution of organization theory. And that trend has been away from a magic bullet, a one-size-fits-all approach, to more of a recognition of a contextual contingency-based approach. Again, this is why my favorite answer is always, it depends. For Merton, it depends upon the beneficiary. So Merton then moves us into the external environment and moves us away from a natural approach to more of an open systems type of an approach. So we said with this open systems approach, we are looking more at the external environment, and we are looking at this two-way street. How does the environment affect the organization, as well as how does the organization affect the environment? He looks at organizations needing to adapt to their external environment in a much more aggressive manner. That's what open systems theory and Katz and Kahn and others are looking at. So they assume that organizations are going to have to be very aggressive in how they adapt to changes in their environment because environments are inherently very dynamic in nature. An important point of departure from the natural systems theorists is that open systems theorists like Katz and Kahn would make the argument that there's not only entropy, but there's also the counter to that known as negative entropy. So the entropy process, organizations as they age, they dissipate energy and resources into the external environment until they don't have the resources necessary to support themselves. Open systems theorists say, but there's also the potential for negative entropy, whereby organizations do not always deteriorate, but they can import new energy and import new resources from the environment in order to stave off deterioration and going out of existence. So here, what we are saying is that there is a rationale for why we do have organizations that have been in existence for over 200 years, because they've been able to pull and import these new energies from the environment. New energies such as we've discussed before, a stable and well-prepared labor pool, sufficient resources in terms of appropriations or grant funding opportunities, sufficient political support from elected officials, budget makers, and those who pass the enabling legislation that bring our organizations into existence to begin with. Support from the public in terms of our constituency groups, our beneficiaries. If we as managers of organizations can draw upon the support of our constituencies and our client groups, that is going to help us push back on elected officials who want to take away our appropriations or reduce our appropriations or even take us out of existence. So those are new energies we can pull in through this negative entropy process. The goal here with open systems theory is for organizations to find the balance with their external environment, where they are in harmony and in balance with the environment in which they operate. That is your point of homeostasis. That is your steady state here in open systems theory. Open systems theorists also give us our 25-cent word of the night, which is equifinality. Equifinality is a concept that says there are a number of different paths that organizations can pursue in order to find this balance with their external environment, to find their point of homeostasis. That there's just not one path that every organization pursues. Organizations find and pursue their own paths to homeostasis. This again suggests to us a contextual and contingency-based way of studying our organizations. So as I said, two of the primary authors in open systems theory are Katz and Kahn. Katz and Kahn, their focus is primarily on our model of open systems. Clearly, we are looking at this through an open systems lens, looking at the external environment and how the organization can find a balance with its external environment. We can find that balance with our external environment when we have a motivated workforce and we have well-established processes that will allow us to extract these resources from the environment. So even though we see Tompkins focusing primarily on open systems, I do think there are elements of human relations as well as internal process that we could probably build into this as well. But overall, the primary focus is certainly going to be on an open systems type of approach. Our mechanisms for coordination and control, our motivational strategies, nothing is highlighted because, again, it depends. It depends upon what our external environment looks like, how our external environment is supporting or not supporting the organization. So the strategies that we use will depend upon the characteristics in our external environment. So again, it suggests for us this whole idea of a contingency, contextual type of approach to understanding our organizations. So that's what we consider to be open systems theory. I again would argue to you that the vast majority, if not almost all of our public and nonprofit organizations operate within some type of an open system. Now, I don't think it is a dichotomous binary situation. Either it's a closed system or it's an open system. There are gradations to the openness of the system and the openness of the environment. There are some organizations that operate within very stable environments where they have a great deal of support from the public. They have a great deal of support from elected officials. One example could be, for the most part, NASA tends to have a great deal of support among the public. Internally, employees tend to report being very satisfied working in NASA. The NASA and space exploration tends to have pretty strong support in Congress and among presidents as well. Now, there are some hiccups here and there, and bigger than hiccups, I guess I should say, things that have happened that have eroded some of that support from the environment. You think about the Challenger disaster and things such as that. So there have been some points in time where the support from the environment has eroded a bit. But overall, NASA still works in a pretty supportive environment. You think about an organization like the Department of Education that I've mentioned before. That's an example of a department that is working in a very hostile and a very unsupportive type of environment. You don't have the political support coming from the White House. You don't have the political support for the Department of Education coming from within Congress. While you do have some public support, that public support is coming primarily on a very partisan type of basis, where it's coming from one political party as opposed to the other. And we see what's happening now with the Department of Education. We have seen a lot of the functions of the Department of Education being farmed out to other organizations. the loans that are in default, I believe, are starting to be farmed out to the Small Business Administration. Special education programs are starting to be farmed out to the Department of Health and Human Services. And obviously, this is all being done for the purpose of, and to end up shuttering the doors of the Department of Education. So I think that's a good example of an organization that does not have the support of its environment, at least currently doesn't have the support of its environment, and really is having some problems trying to exist. And probably if things continue to go in which the way in which they were going, functionally, the Department of Education probably will not be operating from a functional perspective, but I think from a constitutional perspective, Congress created the Department of Education, and so the executive branch can't necessarily get rid of the Department of Education without having the concurrence of Congress. And so it may still exist in one sense or another, but it certainly won't have the same functions that it has had in the past. So it's important for us in open systems theory to understand that environment that we are operating in. And so as those of us who are students of public organizations, we have to not only understand the organization itself, but all these different influences that are coming from the external environment. It makes for a very dynamic situation, and it makes it impossible for us to develop a one-size-fits-all panacea type of theory to apply to all organizations. We have to take a much more contextual and nuanced approach to understanding these organizations. I think it makes our job more difficult in studying organizations, but I think it's a much more appropriate way to study public organizations. So that, in a nutshell, is a relatively quick discussion of natural systems theory, open systems theory, and then Merton and this functional theory is kind of a segue to pull us from the natural approach into the open approach. I consider it to be a more modern theory because, again, even though Katz and Kahn were writing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because our organizations today operate in very open environments, I think open systems theory is the most appropriate way to view our modern organizations. And we've talked a lot about environments, but we know that in the public sector, our environments are inherently political. We know that political environments change frequently. We have a change in the majority in Congress, we have a change in the White House, and we're going to have a major change to the political orientation of that environment. So based upon this discussion of systems theory, my question now to you for our breakout rooms is to apply this to your organizations. So what I would like for us to do is we'll go into our breakout rooms. And I'll create those in just a second. But what we will do is I want each room to consider the environments in which your organizations operate. Are these environments representative of what you consider open or closed systems? And provide me with some examples of the environmental influences that your organizations need to deal with on a daily basis. And since I'm assuming most organizations that are public and nonprofit are going to be in somewhat of an open type of system, I am most interested in each room identifying for us some of those specific environmental influences that really come to bear on your organizations. And so I know people work in different organizations, so across your organizations, try and find some commonalities in some of those types of examples of environmental influences. And then, as always, I would like for each of our rooms to select a spokesperson, and then we'll reconvene as a class and have each spokesperson share out what their rooms came up with. But typically, I know we're a little early for a break, but typically we take our break before our breakout exercise. So let's do the same type of thing tonight. So let's go ahead and take a quick break until about 7:20. Come back at 7:20. I'll create our rooms. We'll do this breakout room exercise and then see what we come up with in terms of common environmental influences on our organizations. So take a break and come on back at 7:20. Okay, 7:20. So welcome back. Let me go ahead and set up our breakout rooms. And let's see. We'll go with 3 rooms tonight. Okay. All right, I've created the rooms, and so we have 8 in one room and 7 in the other 2 rooms. So that should work well. I'll go ahead and open the rooms. And again, as we always do, about 30, 40 minutes working together as a breakout rooms, then we'll reconvene, have the spokesperson from each room then share out with the rest of the class. So open the rooms, and then you can go to your assigned room. Okay, rooms are closed. I think we are all back in the main room now. So let's see what each group came up with. So let's start with room number 1.
I
Think
can't
that's
remember our room number, but I think it was mine. Does my team
yeah,
agree?
it is. Your room 1.
Okay, thank you. So we talked about all of our organizations. Most of them, well, all of them are open system. Some of them we could find a little bit of the closed system or maybe the in between, specifically for those that were in law enforcement, because there's a large portion of it where they're just engaging with themselves and not having external influences until even they're coming to decisions about a case. They can't really be swayed by the public, so to speak. So that would be a slight example, but like local government, homeless services, social services, all are very dependent on the external environment and can shape it and be shaped by it. And then for examples, some examples of the environmental influences would be definitely politics. And then that kind of flows into like state and federal government, politics or even budgets affecting what we are able to do, or how we respond. And then also the beneficiaries or stakeholders, which would be like clients or residents or citizens for our cities, if we work there. And then the last one we wanted to provide was just a very specific example from like an external environment that's affecting one of the organizations. And so Erica, if she could share really quickly, she had
Yes.
something from her organization.
Yes. Thank you, Ashley. So, understanding that public organizations with open systems are influenced by state and federal mandates, one example we can provide is the passing of the Big Beautiful Bill that has created new mandates that require not only Orange County Social Services Agency, but all counties to update policies, regulations, and internal procedures in order to be compliant with these new federal mandates. These external policy changes have increased workload and accelerated timelines so that we can remain compliant with those new requirements. And this shows how external political involvement directly shapes internal operations and organizational behavior. Thank
Great,
you.
great, perfect. Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Ashley. Very well done. And it's a great point. The one, one big beautiful bill. I always call it the Reconciliation Act, but one big beautiful bill, whatever it's called. Yeah, it does impose those mandates, and mandates are one of those. Is a great example of those influences on state and local organizations. And the intergovernmental relations, we talk a lot about different types of mandates and how different types of mandates can have differing effects on state and local governments. But one of the things we know about mandates is for public organizations at the state and local level, oftentimes those mandates result in what's called a mismatch. It's a mismatch of prescription and practicality, where the prescription comes from the national government, where the national government is saying, this is what you should do in a very normative way. This is what you should do, and this is how you should do it, but doesn't really think a whole lot about the practicality of how that is going to be done. And all those specifics in terms of the practicality of how to implement those mandates, those specifics are then left to those public organizations at the state and the local level. Also, the problem with those mandates is that they're typically decided at the national level in Washington, D.C., and our state and local public organizations don't have a say in them. And all that they are responsible for doing is carrying out these mandates. And we have tried for a long time to place limitations on the ability of parent governments to put mandates upon subnational governments with varying degrees of success. If you're familiar with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act from the mid 1990s, that was supposed to kind of be the cure-all to fix the problem of federal mandates being handed down to state and local governments, but it was far from it. Essentially, with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, it doesn't go into effect until a member of Congress actually rises to a point of order in Congress and say this proposed mandate violates the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. If no member of Congress stands up and stands up to a point of order, then the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act doesn't go into effect. Also, that Unfunded Mandates Reform Act only applies to mandates that were passed after the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. So any mandates that predated the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act were not covered by that act. And so it really was much more of a rhetorical victory for state and local governments as opposed to a victory in reality. And we've seen states try and do the same thing with their own Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, like here in California, the Prop 1A. But again, there are loopholes that you can drive a semi truck through that still allows the state to place mandates on local governments and loopholes that allow the national government to place these mandates on state and local government. So I'm glad you mentioned mandates because I think that is one of those environmental influences that really has a negative effect on our state and local public organizations. So I really do appreciate that. So thank you very much, Erica and Ashley and room number one. Appreciate that. Let's move on then to room number two.
Hi, I'll be speaking for us. Every organization in our group identified as an open system. Basically, a lot of my group members worked in social services, the federal and tribal level, or county and city levels. We had someone who worked in a women's nonprofit, associated student body, Department of Defense, and myself. I worked for security division for the Port of Long Beach. Um, uh, One big commonality, not so much for myself, was navigating the federal environment at this time with recent executive orders, and there are several proposed budget cuts in federal legislation. There's like a rollback of several DEI related grant funding, creating a lot of external pressures that not a lot of these organizations could just easily absorb or just wait out. Um, so there's not a consistent or constant environmental input coming in. Um, Beyond that, there's a lot of say like volatility in regards to well, there's a variability in inputs in regards to like demographics, like with ASI and Angelica and Isabel were mentioning that it affected their approach because if there was what was it, like there were Afghani immigrants that they were trying to deal with their social services program. Um, and as far as for my job and with Joseph, since I'm on the quasi kind of military tiered structure and Joseph's with the Department of Defense, um, there are a few closed system elements, but but sorry, I'm trying a blank here. Uh, there are a few closed system elements, so it's not like exclusively open.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. A lot of our military, paramilitary organizations, if you're looking for more of a closed type environment, sometimes it's those organizations that kind of approximate a bit more of that closed environment. But you make a great point in terms of the variation in the influences that public organizations have to deal with and how dynamic and changing those influences are. And we because of the political nature of the environment we operate in, we have now what a lot of policy people are referring to as ping pong policy. And ping pong policy is just that it changes so frequently. So whenever we have a new administration comes in, that new administration then spends most of its time undoing the policies of the previous administration. Then you'll have a new administration come in 4 years or 8 years later from a different party that then spends its time undoing the policy initiatives of the preceding administration. And that's kind of what we call that ping pong type of policy. When you've got that type of ping pong approach to your policies, it makes it very difficult for public organizations to predict what's coming down the road next and to respond to all these different types of changes. And so it is a very volatile, very dynamic, and a lot of variation in our political environments. And it's becoming even more so today because of this bifurcation that we have seen from a policy perspective with our political parties. And I won't get started on that because it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we talk about in this class. But I think we're all familiar with just how separated our political parties have become. And a lot of that is because of partisan gerrymandering. And we've all been living through the battles over partisan gerrymandering over the past year, year and a half. And it's gotten worse in terms of partisan gerrymandering. Whenever you have partisan gerrymandering, you have the creation of these safe districts so that members of Congress, members of the House, only have to worry about winning their primary election. They don't have to worry about the general election because they're going to win the general election no matter what, because they're in a very safe district. And so you have people retreating to their partisan affiliations. And you have the Democratic Party then acting more liberal in nature, and the Republican Party acting and looking more conservative in nature, so that when you do have a change in political party in terms of the White House or the majority in Congress, it's not as subtle as it used to be. Now it's going to be a big change from a conservative to a liberal or liberal to conservative. And that's why you end up having this very dynamic type of policy environment that we have to respond to in our public organizations. And so I think it's become worse, and I don't really see a lot of hope for it becoming better as long as we continue down the road to even more partisan gerrymandering in the future. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Eric. Appreciate that. Thank you, room number two. Let's move on to then room number three.
Yeah, I'll be speaking on behalf of room number three. We had a pretty good diverse group of city employees, county employees, social services, research institutions, and school districts, and we all agreed that we were all open systems. And I'll just talk about the three main environmental influences that just kept recurring, which the first one I would go with is political influences. So our goals, our priorities may be shifted due to our board of supervisors, our city managers, our council members, depending on what their priorities are at that moment. But then we also recognize that their priorities are also influenced by external stakeholders, right? So we can talk about our community members, auditors from whether that be the state or the federal government, advocacy groups, and regulatory agencies as well too, just like how we mentioned earlier. The most interesting one to me was economic conditions, right? So with budgets being a lot tighter now, a lot of us have had to kind of shift on, how do we operate with, less funding available, right? We came from a lot of available funding, especially when it came to social services during the ARPA period, and then now we have all the other federal cuts that have come from the one big beautiful bill that was mentioned earlier as well too. And then just other outside economic conditions such as like the interest rates, right? For my organization specifically, we've seen a lot of development slow down just because developers are like, this is not a good time to build. So those are the three main environmental influences that kept recurring within our group.
Great. Thank you, Jared. And the one to pick up on, the one I'm interested in as well, is the same one you said, the economic influences, because those are the ones that tend to be very dynamic and very changing and hard to keep up with. And you're right. We had at certain points of time, we had this influence of federal money through, ARPA or COVID relief funds. And when you have that very transitory type of money coming in from the federal government. And then when that money goes away, that's when you have to struggle with your tighter budgets. I think that a lot of states were really struggling once all those COVID recovery funds went away. That's when they really started struggling. And there was kind of a delay, though, in that we didn't really see the impact immediately. It took a while for that impact to actually manifest itself. And now a lot of states are running into a lot of trouble. And we're seeing a lot of those problems at the local level as well. And I was just reading an article recently, my home state of Ohio, that 170 school districts in the state of Ohio are currently reporting what's called a negative certification for their budgets, meaning that they are not going to forecast having enough revenue to cover their expenditures in the next 2 to 3 years. And we're starting to see some school districts here in California who are suffering the same fate. And the way in which it works with school district financing is if you cannot cover your revenue for 3 years, your revenues to cover your expenditures for 3 years in the future, that's when you have to declare what's called a negative certification. If you are not sure that you can cover it, you can be a qualified type of certification. If you know that you can cover and prove that you can cover your expenditures for the next 3 years, then you're a positive. And we've seen the number of districts that were positive certifications slip. And so we see a more qualified, and now we're starting to see more negative certifications. That really has some important implications in terms of local control for education. And a lot of that's coming from the reduction in federal funds. The reduction in federal funds for special education programs also has been very challenging for education here in the state of California. It will be very interesting, and it's actually making a lot of people very nervous. The whole idea of moving special education programs out of the Department of Education into Health and Human Services, what's going to happen with that special education funding? Currently, local districts tend to be reimbursed at about 40% of what they're owed by the federal government. The other 60% local districts have to make up on their own, oftentimes taking money from their general fund to pay for special education. If the amount of money coming out of Health and Human Services for special education is going down again and getting decreased again, and if you can really forecast maybe the federal government will only be reimbursing 20 to 30%, you can imagine what then is going to happen to these educational agencies across the country, and especially here in the state of California, where our spending on special education tends to be a lot higher than what you see across a lot of other states. And so I agree, those economic influences tend to be the most impactful for most of our public organizations, kind of regardless of what policy sector they tend to be operating in. So I do find those types of influences to be interesting. And from a budgeting and finance perspective, whenever we tend to lose that federal money as a local government, then when we have to decide how to then make cuts to try and make up for that lost federal revenue, those cuts tend to occur in things like preventive maintenance. So we cut back on preventive maintenance because that's one of the least visible cuts that we can make to our citizens. But if you continue to make those cuts to preventive maintenance, then all those cuts year after year will then end up accumulating into a major infrastructure crisis. And so a lot of our local governments are looking straight at a major infrastructure crisis because of all those years of reducing spending on preventative maintenance. And what compounds that then, if you do have that infrastructure crisis, to respond to the infrastructure crisis, you have to go out there and issue debt because you have to borrow that money. Well, as you mentioned, with interest rates, as interest rates go up, it becomes more difficult for you to borrow that money at a rate where you can actually repay that debt. Also, your your bond rating starts to be hurt as a local government in those types of situations, which again then compounds the problem of being able to go out there and borrow and access that money to then try and mitigate some of that infrastructure crisis. And so it almost becomes this domino effect where the ball starts rolling downhill, and once it starts rolling, it's really difficult to stop it. So I think that the takeaway from all this is obviously that as public organizations, our environments are certainly a lot more varied and a lot more challenging and political than what we might see over in the private sector. And because of that, our system is a very open system, and we are then subject to a lot of these environmental influences. You add on to that the transparency that is required of public organizations because of managing public taxpayer money, especially in a state here like California, where we have all these sunshine laws that we have to adhere to. And whenever you have those transparency laws, then you're going to have even more opening up of the organizations to the system and the external influences. Well, very well done. Thank you for all three of our groups. Where we go from here is to move into a discussion of some additional, what I like to call more modern organization theories. I know that this kind of takes us into what was on the syllabus then for our Monday evening session. So even though it's only 8:30, I would propose that maybe we stop here for tonight, give you the opportunity to make sure that you've had a chance to read the material on some of these theories, such as participative management, quality management, organization culture. So once you have read that material, I think that a lot of this will make a lot more sense if we talk about it at that point in time. So I would propose we'll stop here for tonight. Then we get together again on Monday. We will cover the remainder of our organization theories going up through organization culture and leadership. We'll do all that in the first half of class on Monday. Then, if anyone is willing to do their presentation on Monday, just send me an email and let me know that. I will put you on the agenda for the second half of class on Monday. Or once we get to our Monday session, if you decide in the session that you're ready to present, just flag me down and let me know, and you'll be able to present in the second half of the session. So we'll do those presentations in the second half on Monday, and then we'll reserve our very last session next Wednesday for all the remainder of the presentations. Okay, sound good? Erica, go ahead.
Quick question, Dr. Powell. During the very first session that we had with you, we discussed the organizational analysis paper and using like the process of scaffolding. Are we able to use any of our content for our essay discussion post in our paper, like bringing over, those same concepts or thoughts that we had on there?
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Okay.
that's a great point. That's the whole purpose of the scaffolding is that, yes, what you're doing in your Canvas essays when you're talking about the organization, description of the organization, when you're talking about classic organization theory, neoclassical theories, all those things can certainly then be brought over into the organizational analysis paper. And hopefully what you've then gotten after you have done those Canvas essays is you've gotten some feedback from your colleagues that you can then incorporate that feedback if you feel it is necessary and helpful. But absolutely, those are all meant to help you write the organizational analysis paper.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, and you don't have to cite that in the paper. You don't have to say, cite what you wrote in Canvas essay number 3 or whatever. You don't have to worry about doing that for this paper either.
Thank you.
Sure. Lizette, go ahead.
Hello. So I have a question regarding the final assessment paper. How long does that have to be?
It's going to be very short because all you're doing is just answering those 3 questions. So 1 or 2 paragraphs for each question. Typically, they are literally less than 3 to 4 pages.
Okay.
Any other questions or if I see any other hands up? Anything else?
Sorry, I had my hand up, but that was the exact same question I had, so thank you.
Okay. Well, that's convenient. Good.
Oh, sorry, Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to recheck again. Sorry. I don't know, I'm blanking. So for the organizational analysis paper, are we allowed to tap into our previous Canvas discussion posts and kind of, so basically just maybe even rewrite a little bit and just use material?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that's something that's a scaffolding approach that we talked about that I like to use in my courses. When you get to other courses with other instructors, that's something you'll want to explore with them. Some instructors like to have separate Canvas essays, separate topics than for their post-instructional assignment. So it's kind of instructor preference. I like to give you the opportunity to use those Canvas essays to build your organizational analysis paper, which is your post-instructional assignment. So for you to remember for this course, the pre-instructional assignment will be those 4 Canvas essays that you are doing in discussion board, and then the post-instructional assignment is the organizational analysis paper. So when you get to the end of the program in 697 and you've completed your 5 cases and you're ready to put your student learning portfolio together, in part 2 of that student learning portfolio, you'll be putting in those Canvas essays as your pre-instructional from this class and your organizational analysis paper as your post-instructional for this 660 course. So that's kind of how we're handling part 2 of the portfolio for 660. Different courses will have different pre and post instructional assignments, and you've probably already seen that, at least in one of your courses. You don't have that in 500, but you've had that in your previous course. And then you'll have the same type of situation in I think it's public budgeting and finance you're going on to next on, I think it's July 11th when that begins. It'll be the same type of thing where Dr. Williams will say, here is your pre-instructional, and then here is your post-instructional assignment. I hope I have my schedules correct because I'm juggling 3 different cohort schedules. We have your schedule, the other cohort 26, and then we still have cohort 25. They're finishing their coursework throughout the rest of the summer and through the fall. So through the end of the fall, we'll have 3 cohorts that are running concurrently. Once the fall semester is over, then we'll be back down to just the 2 cohort 26s. But then beginning again in February, then we'll have cohort 27 that will be onboarding. So we have a lot of cohorts running all at the same time. I try and keep them all straight in my head, but I believe that is your schedule that you're going on to public budgeting and finance next. And if I've got that right, I just communicate with Dr. Williams, who will be your instructor for public budgeting. You'll love having Dr. Williams. He not only has his doctorate in public administration, but he also is and has been a finance director for a number of cities here in Southern California. So he does a wonderful job of combining both the theory from the world of academics with the practicality of actually being a finance director. And I just communicated with him a couple of days ago, and he's got the class up and ready to go, and he's then going to be able to open up that Canvas site very quickly for you and allow you to get access to that Canvas site. So I think you will really get a lot out of that public budgeting and finance course that you're going into next. Okay. As you are working on your organizational analysis paper and your final assessment, always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions at all or need any clarifications. Just shoot me an email. I am catching a flight early tomorrow morning and will be out of town through Sunday, but I'll still have access to my email. So feel free if you have any questions between now and Sunday, still feel free to email me and I'm happy to answer any of those questions. Otherwise, we'll then be back together on Monday. Again, if you have a commitment on Monday, I understand that. You don't have to be here if you have a commitment. The session will be recorded just like all of our other sessions, and then you can always reach out to me if you have any questions about it. But again, if you want to present on Monday, send me an email and we'll get you on the agenda for the second half of class. Okay. All right, enjoy the rest of your week, and I will talk to everyone again then on Monday. So take care and have a great week.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you. Good night, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
you.